1943. Europe is a continent on fire. The roar of Allied bombers fills the sky, and beneath, cities crumble under relentless bombing campaigns. Streets that were once bustling marketplaces are now littered with rubble and silence. In this chaos, thousands of Allied airmen are falling from the sky, parachuting into occupied territory, often landing in the hands of the German military. For most, capture meant fear, dread, and a very real threat of brutality. The stories that circulated among squadrons told of Gestapo cells, merciless interrogations, and sometimes executions for those unlucky enough to be suspected of sabotage. Prisoners were trained to resist, to give only names, ranks, and serial numbers, yet even that required courage under conditions designed to break men. And yet, in a seemingly ordinary interrogation center outside Frankfurt, something astonishing was taking place. A Luftwaffe officer, tall, calm, and meticulous, greeted these men not with shouts, not with fists, but with politeness. He offered tea. "My name is Hanns Scharff. Please sit down. You've had a difficult flight," he would say, in perfect English. His voice carried the ease of a man who had lived in ordinary streets, among ordinary people, a man who understood the rhythms of conversation, the cadence of human thought. There was nothing intimidating in his demeanor. No harsh glare, no raised hand. Just observation, patience, and a smile. What followed in his interrogation rooms would confound both his prisoners and his superiors. Within hours, pilots divulged information that would have been nearly impossible to extract through threats or fear. Flight routes, bomber formations, radio codes, all of it spilled not under duress, but through carefully cultivated rapport. Hanns Scharff was not a conventional interrogator. He was a paradox. A Nazi officer whose mission was to win intelligence from enemies of the Reich, yet he chose methods that flew in the face of wartime brutality. And in doing so, he became one of the most effective interrogators of World War II. To understand how he arrived at this unusual approach, we must look at his origins. Hanns Scharff was born in Berlin in 1907, into a family that prized education, discipline, and modest comfort. As a boy, he grew quiet and observant, fascinated by human behavior. His curiosity was not morbid, it was analytical. Even early on, he noticed the subtleties in how people spoke, moved, and reacted under stress, skills that would later define his career. In the 1930s, Germany was a country in transformation. Political unrest and economic hardship marked the era. Yet amidst the chaos, Scharff pursued a civilian path, a career in textiles. He traveled the country selling fabrics, meeting clients in homes, factories, and shops. These travels honed his observational skills and his ability to read people, traits that would prove invaluable when the stakes were life and death. Marriage also played a formative role in Scharff's character. His wife, Margaret, admired his patience and level-headedness. Friends later recounted that Hanns often resolved disputes among colleagues without raising his voice, relying instead on understanding and empathy. He had a natural talent for drawing people out, a talent that would become his signature method in interrogation. By 1939, the shadow of war loomed over Europe. Scharff was drafted into the Luftwaffe, initially a reluctant participant. He had no desire for violence, yet his talents were immediately recognized. Observant, patient, and intelligent, he was assigned to a special unit, Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center for captured Allied airmen. By the 1930s, Hanns Scharff had become a textile salesman, traveling across Germany. He visited homes, factories, and shops, meeting clients from all walks of life. Each encounter honed his natural talent, reading people, gauging reactions, discerning subtle truths from casual words or gestures. These skills, seemingly mundane in a civilian context, would later become the foundation of his interrogation techniques. Marriage to Margaret was a stabilizing force. She admired his patience, analytical mind, and his ability to resolve conflicts without aggression. Their relationship exemplified Scharff's philosophy: careful observation, gentle persuasion, and empathy could accomplish what force could not. Yet history's currents were inexorable. By 1939, the war had begun, and Scharff, like many Germans of his generation, was drafted into the Luftwaffe. At first, he had no desire for violence, no ambition to become part of the machinery of war. But his superiors recognized something vital: an acute understanding of human behavior, an ability to extract information subtly, and the patience to watch and wait. By 1942, Scharff was stationed at Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation center for Allied airmen. These centers were designed to extract intelligence swiftly and decisively, often relying on intimidation, coercion, or outright violence. Standard protocol involved isolating prisoners, breaking their morale, and demanding compliance. Scharff, however, immediately observed a flaw. Threats and brutality often yielded false information. Prisoners lied, resisted, or deliberately misled their captors. Conversely, when he observed prisoners closely and treated them with dignity, they gradually opened up. He noted something even more profound: prisoners had a deep-seated human need to be understood, to share their experiences, and to assert their competence. His radical approach began modestly. He offered tea. He listened. He watched. He made small talk about life before the war, about sports, hobbies, and the mundane details of home. These gestures built trust. They humanized the captor in the eyes of the captive. And in that environment, information flowed naturally. Allied pilots were often baffled. They expected anger and fear. Instead, they found patience, curiosity, and insight. Scharff's method became a form of psychological mastery, the art of coaxing truth without force. Psychological techniques. Scharff's genius lay in subtle manipulation combined with empathy. He noticed micro-expressions, fleeting twitches, subtle changes in tone, hesitation, and used these cues to guide his questioning. He employed indirect tactics, suggesting that other prisoners had revealed details, prompting confirmation or correction, which often produced more information than direct questioning could. He also leveraged the prisoner's ego and sense of pride. By treating airmen as competent and intelligent, he fostered a willingness to engage and share. The psychological principle was clear: people respond best when they feel respected, not threatened. Stories from surviving POWs illuminate this approach. One pilot recounted, "He never yelled. He never threatened. He made us feel human, and somehow, we told him things we had sworn to keep secret." Another remembered Scharff casually asking about baseball and American towns, bridging the gap between captor and captive with conversation, small gestures, and shared humanity. Hanns Scharff's methods were a paradox: a Nazi officer performing humane acts while serving the Reich. His superiors doubted him, yet the results were undeniable. Information that other interrogators failed to extract flowed freely under his guidance. In a war dominated by fear and violence, Hanns Scharff demonstrated that observation, empathy, and understanding could be far more powerful. To understand the full scope of this paradox, how a man trained in war became a master of psychology, trust, and subtle persuasion, we must follow his life chronologically, from the streets of Berlin to the rooms of Dulag Luft, and eventually, to post-war America, where the same talents found expression in art rather than war. From businessman to Luftwaffe, the making of Hanns Scharff. Berlin in the 1920s was a city of contrasts. On one hand, there were bustling streets lined with shops, cafes, and trams. On the other, the shadow of post-war despair lingered in the faces of the unemployed and the veterans who haunted the avenues. Into this environment, Hanns Scharff stepped as a young adult, quiet, observant, and unremarkable to many, yet internally absorbing the rhythms of human behavior like a sponge. By 1925, Hanns was finishing his secondary education. Though he excelled academically, he displayed a curiosity that went beyond textbooks. History, literature, art, and social interaction fascinated him. He noticed the subtle cues in conversation, a shift in tone, a fleeting glance, a hesitation before speech, and catalogued them mentally. To Hanns, these were the small truths that revealed character, motivation, and intention. Even as a teenager, he had an unusual capacity for empathy. Friends remembered that he could calm disputes simply by listening. He would not impose opinions or judgment, he merely guided discussions, letting others see themselves reflected in his observations. This quiet talent would later evolve into a potent psychological tool in the interrogation rooms of Dulag Luft. Early career. After graduation, Hanns pursued a career as a textile salesman, traveling across Germany. At first glance, the profession seems mundane, yet it was here that he honed the skills that would later make him an unparalleled interrogator. Meeting clients from all walks of life, he learned to adapt: the stubborn factory owner, the meticulous tailor, the hurried homemaker, the skeptical merchant. Every meeting was a miniature study in human psychology. He noted which arguments persuaded, which gestures encouraged trust, and which subtle cues indicated deceit. He practiced reading expressions, discerning tone, and interpreting pauses. He became adept at identifying what a person wanted to hide, and what they were willing to share if approached correctly. Hanns' personality, calm, patient, and attentive, drew people toward him. Unlike many salesmen who relied on forceful tactics or flattery, Hanns depended on observation and gentle engagement. He learned that human beings, left unpressured, would often reveal more than if coerced. This principle, developed in the streets of Berlin and factories of northern Germany, would become the foundation of his interrogation philosophy. Marriage and personal life. During these years, Hanns met Margaret, his future wife. Their relationship was defined by mutual respect and admiration. She recognized his extraordinary patience, his ability to listen, and his sensitivity to the emotions of others. Hanns, in turn, valued her perspective and counsel. It was Margaret who reinforced the qualities that would later define his approach to interrogation: empathy, patience, and careful attention to nuance. Friends remembered Hanns as disciplined but approachable. He avoided unnecessary conflict, and even in moments of disagreement, he would pause, reflect, and consider the other person's perspective. This temperament was unusual in a society increasingly drawn toward conformity and aggression, yet it set him apart in ways that would become critical during the war. Germany on the brink. The late 1930s brought seismic changes. Political unrest, the rise of the Nazi Party, and growing militarization transformed Germany. Hanns, while observant, remained focused on his work and personal life. Yet the tide of history was inexorable. By 1939, as war erupted across Europe, he was drafted into the Luftwaffe, a pivotal moment that would change the trajectory of his life. Hanns' superiors quickly recognized a rare talent. While many soldiers excelled in physical skill or tactical prowess, Hanns demonstrated an exceptional capacity for understanding human behavior. He could assess character, gauge truth, and anticipate reactions, a skill far more valuable than brute force. Even within the military hierarchy, where aggression was often prized over insight, his abilities did not go unnoticed. It was soon decided that Hanns would be assigned to Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation center for captured Allied airmen. Transition to interrogation. At Dulag Luft, Hanns encountered a world of fear, discipline, and rigid protocol. The standard interrogation method was intimidation, threats, isolation, and sometimes outright physical abuse. Many officers believed that breaking a prisoner's spirit was the fastest way to obtain information. Hanns observed these methods carefully. He noted their effectiveness and their shortcomings. Intimidation often produced false information. Fear rarely yielded cooperation beyond what was strictly necessary. And in some cases, it hardened the prisoner's resolve. Hanns' approach would diverge dramatically. He began by observing, listening, and establishing subtle trust. He offered small comforts: tea, conversation, cigarettes. He allowed prisoners to feel human, even in captivity. By creating a safe space, he lowered defenses without ever raising his voice or resorting to violence. Early lessons in human behavior. Hanns' early interrogations were experiments in human psychology. He observed how small gestures could unlock conversations. A compliment, a shared anecdote, or a recognition of the prisoner's courage could produce far more than threats ever would. A pilot later recalled, "He treated us as if we were equals. We expected cruelty, but found patience. Somehow, we spoke more freely than we ever had with anyone before." Scharff realized that empathy, coupled with acute observation, was more effective than any weapon. He could anticipate lies, detect hesitation, and guide conversations toward truth, all without a single act of aggression. These lessons, learned through patient practice and reflection, would become the blueprint for his methods throughout the war. Every detail mattered: timing, phrasing, pacing, and the subtle cues of body language. By the time Hanns Scharff was fully operational at WWII, he had become a master of observation, human psychology, and subtle persuasion. The foundation of his skills had been laid during his early life: attentive childhood observation, a career in sales, marriage and personal reflection, and careful study of human behavior. The story of Hanns Scharff is not simply a story of a Nazi officer. It is a story of how one man used understanding, patience, and empathy to achieve extraordinary results in the midst of a brutal and unforgiving war. Next, early interrogations, turning observation into strategy. We will examine how Hanns applied these lessons, developed his unique techniques, and began influencing the outcome of the air war over Europe. Berlin, 1942. Hanns Scharff arrived at WWII, the Luftwaffe interrogation center just outside Frankfurt, carrying with him the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years observing people, listening to subtle cues, and cataloging the nuances of human behavior. The world outside was burning. The skies were filled with the drone of bombers, the sharp whistle of falling aircraft, and the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire. Yet inside the gates of WWII, the war operated on a different plane, a war of minds, words, and subtle manipulation. Hanns immediately noticed the prevailing culture. Most interrogators relied on intimidation, shouting, isolation, or, in some extreme cases, physical abuse. It was a culture that prized fear above understanding, compliance above insight. Scharff recognized the limitations of these methods. Fear produced superficial information, false leads, and hardened resistance. He realized that coercion was a blunt instrument, and he would wield something far more precise: observation, patience, and empathy. On his first day, he met a young British bomber pilot, barely 19, trembling from exhaustion and fear. While other officers would have demanded names and serial numbers with raised voices, Hanns poured tea, asked about the pilot's hometown, inquired about his family, and listened. Every gesture, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion was a clue. Within the span of an hour, the pilot had disclosed more than any conventional interrogation had achieved, and he did so willingly. Hanns meticulously recorded every detail, not as a detached bureaucrat, but as an observer of human behavior, noting how subtle praise, small comforts, or casual conversation could unlock guarded minds. Over the weeks and months, Hanns refined his method. He began each session with warmth and familiarity, offering cigarettes, tea, or a small snack. He spoke in calm tones, avoided confrontation, and allowed prisoners space to think, speak, and even argue. He recognized that trust, however brief or fragile, was a conduit for truth. He noticed patterns: hesitation indicated fear, micro-expressions betrayed deception, and moments of pride could be leveraged to encourage disclosure. Every question was carefully crafted, every silence strategically employed. Hanns also understood the power of suggestion. If a prisoner hesitated to reveal a detail, he might casually remark that another airman had mentioned certain information, prompting the prisoner to correct or confirm, often revealing far more than intended. It was a psychological dance, delicate and precise, honed over countless sessions. Stories from Allied airmen later described the surreal experience of being questioned by Scharff. One recalled sitting in a room bracing for fear, only to be offered tea and conversation. Another described the odd comfort of speaking with a man who treated him like an intelligent adult rather than a mere prisoner. Many were confused, yet they could not deny that they had disclosed crucial information almost effortlessly. Hanns' approach extended beyond verbal tactics. He paid attention to the environment, seating arrangements, the angle of light, the presence of windows, the accessibility of small comforts. Walks in the yard, casual talks about home, and the occasional allowance of humor became tools to build rapport. He knew that a human being in distress craved connection and that providing it strategically could yield results more reliable than threats. Hanns also innovated with indirect questioning, the art of letting the prisoner guide the conversation while subtly directing it toward key intelligence points. He would ask open-ended questions, observe reactions, and, when necessary, gently steer the discussion. Over time, this method proved astonishingly effective. He extracted flight routes, bomber formations, radio frequencies, and operational plans, often without the prisoners realizing the significance of what they were revealing. It was not just technical intelligence he obtained, it was insights into behavior, decision-making, and morale, all of which informed Luftwaffe planning. The contrast between Scharff and his peers became stark. While some officers relied on fear and brute force, he relied on the mind, observation, and subtle persuasion. Senior officers initially doubted his methods, but the results were undeniable. Prisoners consistently provided accurate and detailed information, reducing errors and revealing patterns that had eluded more aggressive interrogators. Hanns' reputation grew quietly within Dulag Luft. Pilots began to remember his calm demeanor, his attentiveness, and the strange sense of safety in his presence. He became known informally among Allied airmen as the gentleman interrogator. Anecdotes abound. One pilot recounted that Hanns had casually discussed American baseball teams during an interrogation, creating a shared human connection that lowered the man's defenses. Another remembered that he was offered chocolate and permitted small liberties during questioning, gestures that seemed trivial but had a profound psychological impact. These small acts of humanity were not mere niceties, they were deliberate tools. Hanns understood the human mind in crisis and crafted an environment where it could reveal itself voluntarily. He recognized that coercion often led to deception, whereas trust, carefully cultivated, led to revelation. By the end of 1942, Hanns had developed a comprehensive methodology. Begin with warmth of. The spring of 1943 marked a turning point in Hanns Scharff's career. By now, he had settled into his role at Dulag Luft, the Luftwaffe's interrogation center outside Frankfurt, and had begun to refine the techniques that would later make him legendary. The world around him remained a theater of destruction. Allied bombers tore through the skies, cities burned, and countless lives were caught in the relentless machinery of war. Yet within the confines of the interrogation rooms, a different war was being fought, one not with bullets or bombs, but with conversation, observation, and psychological insight. Scharff had already learned that coercion and fear often produced unreliable results. Prisoners subjected to threats or brutality tended to lie, resist, or provide partial information. Patience, empathy, and strategic engagement, he discovered, elicited truth more reliably. He began to codify a systematic approach. Every session, every question, every gesture was carefully considered. Before an airman even entered the room, Scharff observed the minutiae, posture, gait, facial expression, the way the man's hands moved. These were the silent signals that spoke volumes about fear, pride, or deception. Once inside, he employed a combination of techniques designed to lower defenses while maintaining control. He offered tea or cigarettes, allowed prisoners small comforts, and engaged them in casual conversation about family, hometowns, sports, or leisure. These seemingly trivial exchanges were far from accidental. They were calculated acts of psychological strategy. Scharff understood the principle of reciprocity. Humans are more likely to provide information when they feel respected and valued. By offering comfort and attention, he created a subtle obligation, a willingness to share. He also observed timing carefully. Questions were never rushed. Silences were strategically employed. When a prisoner hesitated, Scharff allowed the pause to extend just long enough to encourage disclosure, guiding the conversation with gentle suggestions rather than commands. One of his most effective tools was the use of indirect suggestion. He might casually mention that another airman had reported certain information, prompting the prisoner to confirm or correct, often revealing far more than intended. He discovered that the human mind is most forthcoming when it believes it is actively contributing to the dialogue rather than being coerced. Over time, Scharff began to recognize recurring patterns in behavior. Young pilots often displayed subtle signs of fear, tension in their shoulders, averted gaze, or shifts in breathing. Experienced officers sometimes relied on bluffing or partial truth. Every micro-expression, every nuanced reaction was catalogued mentally and recorded in his notes, forming a detailed map of human behavior under stress. These observations allowed him to tailor his approach to each individual, creating a bespoke interrogation strategy that leveraged both the mind and the emotions of his subjects. Allied airmen who passed through his rooms later recounted the surreal nature of these sessions. One pilot remembered sitting across from Scharff, expecting violence or intimidation, only to be offered tea and a cigarette. The room smelled faintly of polish and tobacco. The sunlight filtered through blinds and patterns across the floor. Scharff asked about baseball, the American countryside, or the pilot's hometown, and the man found himself talking, almost unconsciously, revealing information that would have taken days to extract under traditional methods. Another recounted being asked detailed questions about bomber formations and flight plans while discussing leisure activities in a tone that was calm, friendly, and entirely devoid of aggression. In these moments, prisoners were disarmed not by fear but by human connection, a testament to Scharff's understanding of psychology. Beyond conversation, he carefully crafted the environment to reinforce trust. Interrogation rooms were orderly, clean, and well lit. Seating was arranged to reduce intimidation, and windows allowed glimpses of the outside world, reminding prisoners that they were not completely enclosed or powerless. Walks in the yard, occasional humor, and permission to smoke or write letters all contributed to a sense of normalcy, subtly encouraging openness. Scharff also studied the personal pride and ego of each prisoner. He recognized that the desire to appear competent and clever could be leveraged to encourage disclosure. By engaging prisoners as intelligent individuals capable of meaningful discussion, he elicited more information than brute force ever could. These methods were applied consistently across hundreds of prisoners, with striking results. Flight routes, bomber schedules, radio codes, and strategic plans were disclosed without coercion, often more accurately than information obtained through traditional interrogation methods. Hanns' success did not go unnoticed. Within the Luftwaffe, his superiors began to recognize the efficiency and effectiveness of his techniques. While some colleagues continued to rely on threats and intimidation, Scharff's results spoke for themselves, demonstrating that the human mind, carefully understood and engaged, could be a more powerful weapon than fear. During this period, he also faced ethical reflections. Unlike many officers, he maintained a personal code. No prisoner would be physically harmed under his watch. He understood that violence often produced resistance, resentment, and falsehood. By adhering to this principle, he maintained both effectiveness and a measure of humanity, an unusual stance in a conflict defined by brutality. The effectiveness of his approach is evident in the anecdotal records. One pilot described providing detailed operational information after only a brief conversation, remarking later that he felt he was speaking to someone who understood, not someone who would punish. Another recalled the surreal feeling of trust emerging in an interrogation room, a paradox in the midst of war. Scharff's approach extended to meticulous note-taking and reflection. He documented patterns of deception, common psychological tendencies, and effective phrasing, effectively creating a personal manual of interrogation based on observation, empathy, and careful experimentation. These records later informed both military historians and the Allied forces, who studied his methods after the war for lessons in intelligence gathering. By the summer of 1944, Hanns Scharff had become a master of psychological interrogation. His rooms were calm, orderly, and humanized. His questions were precise, indirect, and tailored to the individual, and his observations of body language, micro-expressions, and emotional cues allowed him to guide conversations toward truth with remarkable reliability. He had demonstrated that, even in the most brutal context of total war, intelligence could be obtained not through fear and coercion, but through insight, empathy, and careful observation. Hanns' legacy during this period is multifaceted. He achieved unparalleled operational success, gathering critical intelligence that informed Luftwaffe planning. He challenged conventional wisdom about interrogation, proving that understanding and patience could outperform threats and violence. And he upheld a personal ethical standard, refusing to harm prisoners physically while achieving remarkable results. In the broader context of World War II, these achievements illustrate a profound paradox. In a war dominated by destruction and dehumanization, one man demonstrated that the human mind could be both a tool and a weapon, capable of shaping events through trust, understanding, and psychological mastery. Allied intelligence officers would later recognize the brilliance of his methods, incorporating lessons from his techniques into post-war training programs. Hanns Scharff's work during this period serves as both a historical record and a study in the art of persuasion, demonstrating that insight, patience, and empathy can be as potent as any instrument of war. In the quiet, sunlit rooms of Gulag Luft, amidst the turmoil of a world at war, Hanns Scharff perfected an approach that balanced effectiveness with humanity, a paradox that would define his legacy long after the guns fell silent. By 1944, Hanns Scharff had fully established himself as the Luftwaffe's most unconventional yet effective interrogator. His reputation, though known quietly among Allied airmen, spread among officers and intelligence analysts within the German military. Unlike his colleagues, who relied on threats, intimidation, and sometimes outright violence, Scharff employed a method rooted entirely in observation, empathy, and subtle psychological manipulation. He became known among prisoners as the gentleman interrogator, a figure who was courteous, patient, and entirely devoid of aggression, yet astonishingly effective in eliciting critical intelligence. Within the walls of Gulag Luft, Scharff's technique had evolved into a precise, almost surgical practice. Every element of the interrogation was considered: the lighting in the room, the positioning of chairs, the subtle placement of a cup of tea or a piece of chocolate on the desk. He understood that comfort, even in the smallest forms, lowered resistance and allowed for greater disclosure. When a pilot entered the room, Scharff would observe posture, the alignment of shoulders, the angle of the head, and even micro-movements of the eyes and hands. He catalogued hesitation, twitching, and body tension, interpreting these as indicators of fear, pride, or deceit. His questions were framed to allow prisoners to feel in control, to share information voluntarily while believing they were asserting themselves, not being coerced. He employed indirect suggestion masterfully. For example, if a prisoner resisted revealing a bomber route, Scharff might casually mention that another airman reported flying near the Rhine at 0300 hours. The subtle hint prompted correction or elaboration, often yielding more intelligence than direct questioning would have. It was a method that combined the science of observation with the art of conversation. Allied airmen who experienced Scharff's sessions recalled the surreal nature of the interactions. One American pilot remembered sitting across from him, trembling, certain that fear or pain awaited, only to be greeted with a smile and an offer of tea. Scharff asked about his hometown, his family, and what he did before the war, and somehow, amidst this calm, the pilot found himself discussing flight plans and bomber schedules with astonishing accuracy. Another recalled the casual discussion of American baseball teams, a conversation that seemed trivial but built a bridge of trust, opening channels for disclosure. Humor, empathy, and shared human experience became tools of interrogation, as effective as any weapon on the battlefield. Scharff's methods were not merely anecdotal, they were systematic. He observed, recorded, and reflected on every interaction, continuously refining his approach. He recognized that every prisoner was unique, and each session required adaptation. The environment, tone, pacing, and even minor gestures all played a role in the psychology of disclosure. By treating prisoners as competent, intelligent individuals, he tapped into their pride and desire to assert themselves, guiding them to reveal information willingly. Despite his effectiveness, Scharff faced an ethical paradox that distinguished him from many contemporaries. He was a Nazi officer serving the Reich, extracting intelligence to aid in military operations, yet he refused to harm prisoners physically. He rejected violence as a tool, understanding that fear often yielded false information and resentment. By maintaining humane standards, he not only preserved his moral integrity but also increased the reliability of the intelligence he gathered. Over time, his techniques produced critical operational intelligence. Flight routes, bomber formations, radio codes, and logistical details were disclosed with remarkable accuracy. Officers who doubted his methods were forced to acknowledge their effectiveness, and his reputation quietly grew within military circles. Anecdotes of Scharff's sessions are abundant. One British pilot recalled being asked to describe a routine mission while simultaneously discussing family life and hobbies. The combination of conversation, comfort, and subtle observation prompted him to share information he had sworn to conceal. Another American airman recounted being asked to identify maps and locations while engaging in lighthearted discussion, leaving him unaware that he was providing valuable operational intelligence. Beyond individual interactions, Scharff's methodology represented a philosophical shift in interrogation. Intelligence could be obtained through trust, empathy, and observation rather than brute force. His careful attention to microexpressions, gestures, tone, and timing allowed him to guide conversations with precision. His ability to maintain calm, focus, and patience in high-pressure situations was extraordinary. Scharff's legacy during this period also extended to training and mentorship within WWII. Though he did not formalize his methods in manuals during the war, his colleagues observed and learned from his approach. The emphasis on observation, rapport building, and ethical conduct created a subtle ripple effect, influencing the interrogation practices of those who worked alongside him. Yet the paradox remained: Hanns Scharff was a man who could extract crucial intelligence from enemies while treating them humanely, operating within a system that often prized fear and cruelty. It was a delicate balance, requiring not only skill but moral clarity. He achieved results that were unparalleled, demonstrating that understanding the human mind could be a more potent weapon than physical coercion. By the end of the war, his effectiveness was undeniable. Not only had he obtained critical intelligence, but he had done so without violating his ethical principles, leaving a unique legacy that combines strategic acumen with humanity. The stories of his interactions spread among Allied airmen, creating a collective memory of the gentleman interrogator, a figure who challenged assumptions about the nature of war, power, and human behavior. In the quiet, ordered rooms of WWII, amidst the chaos of global conflict, Hanns Scharff had perfected an approach to interrogation that combined science, art, and ethics. Each session was a study in psychology, each conversation a carefully crafted exploration of human behavior. The intelligence he gathered influenced military operations, and the methods he pioneered would later inform both Allied and German post-war training programs. His legacy is a testament to the power of observation, patience, and empathy, demonstrating that in a world defined by violence and fear, the mind could become a weapon of extraordinary influence. Hanns Scharff's work during this period reveals a profound truth: intelligence is not merely about extracting facts, but about understanding the people who hold them. By humanizing his approach, he achieved results that others could not, proving that strategy and morality could coexist, even in the darkest chapters of history. By 1944, Hanns Scharff had become the epitome of a paradox in World War II, a Nazi officer who extracted vast amounts of critical intelligence without ever raising a hand in anger or resorting to physical intimidation. The Allied air war over Europe was reaching its climax. Bomber formations routinely faced perilous missions deep into German territory, navigating flak-filled skies and the threat of Luftwaffe fighters. Every piece of intelligence, from the timing of raids to the deployment of anti-aircraft batteries, could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of men. It was in this high-stakes environment that Scharff's work proved transformative. Stories of his effectiveness are legendary, preserved in memoirs, military records, and oral histories. One RAF pilot, after being captured following a failed mission over Hamburg, recounted the eerie calm of Scharff's interrogation room. Unlike the harsh, dimly lit chambers described in other accounts, this room was orderly, sunlit, and surprisingly quiet. Scharff offered tea and conversation, discussing baseball teams and the pilot's hometown before gently guiding the discussion toward mission details. Within a single hour, the pilot had inadvertently provided detailed flight plans, bomber formations, and the location of key airfields, information that might have taken days to extract under conventional methods. Similar accounts appeared across different nationalities. American, British, and even Canadian pilots, who entered Scharff's rooms expecting fear and brutality, left feeling that they had been treated with a measure of respect and dignity. Yet, in this environment of civility, critical intelligence flowed freely. Scharff's mastery lay in his ability to combine observation, empathy, and psychological principles. He noticed microexpressions, the twitch of an eye, the tightening of a jaw, or the fleeting hesitation before a response. Every movement was catalogued and interpreted as a potential clue to the prisoner's thoughts and emotions. By observing these subtle cues, he could predict resistance, gauge the veracity of responses, and decide precisely when and how to press further. He also understood the power of environment. Chairs were positioned to reduce intimidation, windows allowed light and glimpses of the outside world, and small comforts like tea, chocolate, or cigarettes created a sense of normalcy. Walks in the yard, casual discussions, and even humor were deployed strategically, creating rapport and encouraging voluntary disclosure. Scharff's approach was methodical yet adaptable. He tailored each session to the individual prisoner, recognizing that age, nationality, experience, and temperament all influenced responses. Young pilots were often more anxious, responding to gentle reassurances and praise for their courage, while seasoned officers required subtle challenge, engagement of pride, and respect for their competence. In all cases, the principle remained consist. Most freely when prisoners felt respected, understood, and psychologically safe. The results of this approach were extraordinary. Flight routes, bomber formations, radio codes, and strategic operational details were disclosed with remarkable accuracy and reliability. Senior Luftwaffe officers, initially skeptical of Scharff's unconventional methods, had to concede that his results surpassed those achieved by interrogators relying on intimidation or coercion. The intelligence he obtained contributed directly to Luftwaffe defensive planning, impacting how fighter aircraft were deployed and where flak batteries were concentrated. Beyond operational data, Scharff also gleaned insights into morale, training effectiveness, and behavior patterns of Allied pilots. These human-centered observations provided a more nuanced understanding of the enemy, allowing German commanders to anticipate actions and improve defensive strategies. Allied memoirs repeatedly highlight the psychological disarming effect of Scharff's methods. One American pilot remembered entering a room expecting a harsh, threatening figure, and instead finding a calm, courteous officer who asked questions as though engaging in polite conversation. The pilot later reflected that he had shared far more than he intended, simply because the atmosphere allowed him to relax and talk. Another RAF officer described Scharff offering casual remarks about his hometown in Massachusetts, then seamlessly shifting into discussion about bomber formations. The officer did not realize until after the interrogation that he had divulged crucial intelligence. These examples underscore the unique effectiveness of Scharff's approach. Human connection, observation, and empathy yielded results that fear and violence often could not. Scharff's success also highlighted the ethical paradox at the heart of his legacy. He operated within the machinery of the Nazi regime, yet he maintained a personal code: prisoners were never to be physically harmed. He recognized that brutality often produced falsehoods and resistance, reducing the reliability of intelligence. By refusing to harm prisoners, he ensured that the information he obtained was more accurate, consistent, and actionable. His methodology was not accidental. He had spent years honing these techniques, first in civilian life as a salesman observing human behavior, then as a soldier analyzing interactions and responses, and finally in the controlled environment of Gulag Luft. Every element, from verbal phrasing and timing to gestures, seating, and environmental cues, was considered and refined to maximize the likelihood of disclosure without force. Over the course of the war, Hanns Scharff interrogated hundreds of airmen, gathering intelligence that influenced critical military decisions. Flight schedules, target cities, and even information about upcoming raids were obtained with a subtlety and precision unmatched by conventional methods. His record stands not only as a testament to his skill but also as a remarkable example of how understanding human psychology can be applied strategically, even in the midst of global conflict. Perhaps most strikingly, Scharff's work demonstrated that ethical behavior and effectiveness were not mutually exclusive. By treating prisoners humanely, observing their cues, and engaging them intelligently, he achieved extraordinary results without resorting to coercion or physical harm. This combination of skill, ethics, and psychological insight set him apart from his contemporaries and ensured that his legacy would endure long after the war. The intelligence gathered under Scharff's direction shaped Luftwaffe responses, protected resources, and influenced the course of operations. Allied reports after the war, coupled with post-war interviews and analyses, confirmed the effectiveness of his methods and highlighted the surprising paradox that a man operating within one of history's most brutal regimes could achieve success through empathy, observation, and ethical conduct. Hanns Scharff's work during this period is more than a collection of anecdotes or operational success stories. It is a profound study in the art of understanding the human mind, the power of trust, and the strategic value of ethical conduct. Each interrogation session, each observation, and each subtle interaction contributed to a body of work that remains instructive for historians, psychologists, and military strategists alike. In the sunlit rooms of Gulag Luft, amidst the turmoil of global conflict, Hanns Scharff demonstrated a remarkable principle: that the mind can be both weapon and ally, that trust and empathy can be instruments of strategy, and that even in war, human dignity can coexist with operational effectiveness. His legacy from these famous successes echoes through time, reminding us that insight, patience, and humanity are sometimes the most powerful tools available, even in the most violent and unforgiving circumstances. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Europe had become a relentless arena of destruction. Allied bombing raids intensified, leaving cities in ruins and civilians in terror. Within this chaos, Hanns Scharff continued his work at Gulag Luft, refining his methods and quietly perfecting the art of nonviolent interrogation. His reputation, although largely unknown to the public at the time, had spread quietly among Allied airmen. They whispered stories of a German officer who treated them with respect, who listened intently, who guided conversation without coercion, yet somehow, information always flowed. Scharff's methods were no accident. They were the culmination of decades of observation, reflection, and adaptation. He had learned early in life to read the subtle language of human behavior: a fleeting glance, a hesitation before speaking, a tightening of the shoulders. These signals, imperceptible to many, became the foundation of his strategy. At Gulag Luft, each interrogation was approached as a case study in human psychology. He observed not only what was said but how it was said. Tone, pacing, eye movement, and micro-expressions were all meticulously catalogued. Scharff understood that the mind under stress behaves predictably, yet each individual has nuances that can be leveraged. Empathy became his instrument, patience his tool, and observation his guide. Small comforts, a cup of tea, a piece of chocolate, a cigarette, were not mere niceties. They were carefully chosen methods to lower defenses and encourage voluntary disclosure. Walks in the yard, casual conversations about family, hometowns, or hobbies, and even light humor allowed prisoners to relax, creating an environment in which truth could surface naturally. These methods often produced results far beyond the reach of conventional interrogation. Pilots, expecting fear or brutality, found themselves speaking openly, sharing mission details, bomber formations, routes, and radio frequencies. One RAF pilot, recalling his session with Scharff, described the disorienting contrast. He had entered expecting intimidation, only to find calm conversation about baseball and American towns. Yet, in the midst of this casual exchange, he had disclosed precise operational details he had been ordered to withhold. American pilots similarly recalled being drawn into discussions that felt conversational, almost friendly, but from which Scharff extracted intelligence with surgical precision. He employed indirect suggestion masterfully. Rather than pressing directly, he allowed prisoners to correct or confirm subtle statements, which often led them to reveal more than they intended. A remark about another airman's flight, a casual reference to timing or target, would prompt disclosure without the prisoner realizing the significance. By guiding the conversation subtly, Scharff achieved a flow of intelligence that was both accurate and reliable. Scharff also paid close attention to psychological differences. Young pilots, nervous and inexperienced, often responded to gentle praise for courage and reassurances about their treatment. Veteran officers, proud and self-assured, required respect for their competence and subtle challenges that allowed them to demonstrate knowledge and skill. Scharff tailored each interaction individually, a skill that elevated him above conventional interrogators who relied on one-size-fits-all methods. The results were undeniable. Information that might have taken days or even weeks to extract using fear or coercion emerged quickly and reliably under Scharff's guidance. Flight routes, bomber formations, target cities, and even morale assessments were collected efficiently. Allied officers later confirmed the remarkable accuracy of intelligence that had passed through Scharff's hands. His success created an unusual paradox. Within a regime characterized by brutality and coercion, Scharff maintained a strict personal code. No prisoner was ever harmed physically. He recognized that violence often produced falsehoods and hardened resistance, while his method of careful observation and empathy encouraged truthful and voluntary disclosure. This ethical consistency not only preserved his moral integrity, but also enhanced the operational effectiveness of his intelligence work. The cumulative impact of Scharff's techniques extended beyond individual interrogations. Through careful observation of patterns, he provided insights into broader Allied strategies, such as typical bomber formations, preferred flight altitudes, and navigation routes. This intelligence informed Luftwaffe planning, contributing to defensive operations across Germany. Stories from prisoners illustrate the effectiveness of his approach. One American airman recounted that he had shared flight schedules almost unconsciously, drawn into conversation about personal life, hobbies, and local culture. Another RAF officer described how casual remarks about small towns in England led him to confirm operational details he would have otherwise withheld. Each anecdote reinforced the principle that human connection and observation can achieve what threats often cannot. Beyond intelligence gathering, Scharff's work represents a profound study in psychology and strategy. He demonstrated that understanding human behavior, combined with ethical conduct and patience, could become a powerful operational tool. He elevated interrogation from coercion to the art of subtle influence, blending observation, empathy, and careful communication to achieve results previously thought unattainable. By late 1944, Hanns Scharff's approach had matured into a systematic yet adaptive methodology. Every room, gesture, word, and silence was carefully orchestrated to encourage disclosure without coercion. He had turned the act of questioning into a controlled study of human behavior, where trust and rapport were as critical as the questions themselves. Even after the war, Scharff's techniques were studied by Allied intelligence officers as a model of effective interrogation. His legacy is paradoxical yet instructive. A man serving a brutal regime achieved extraordinary success through patience, empathy, and insight, rather than violence. In the quiet, sunlit rooms of Dulag Luft, amidst the roar of war outside, Hanns Scharff demonstrated a principle that resonates beyond the battlefield. The mind is both a weapon and a key. Trust is a tool of strategy, and human understanding can surpass fear as a method of influence. His work challenges assumptions about coercion, showing that ethics and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. The intelligence he gathered, the respect he maintained for prisoners, and the meticulous attention to observation and psychological nuance ensured that his methods would become a reference for future generations. By the end of 1944, Hanns Scharff had left an indelible mark not only on the intelligence world of World War II but also on the broader understanding of human behavior under stress. The gentleman interrogator demonstrated that insight, patience, and empathy could be more effective than intimidation, forever changing the way interrogators approach the delicate balance between strategy and morality. Through each interaction, he proved that intelligence is not merely a collection of facts, but a study in understanding the minds that hold them. And in this, Hanns Scharff's legacy became timeless. The art of observing, listening, and influencing without harm, even in the most violent of human conflicts. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had grown even more brutal, yet within the walls of WWII, Hanns Scharff continued his work, quietly redefining the practice of interrogation. The skies above Germany were dominated by Allied bombers, and every mission carried enormous stakes for both sides. Intelligence was paramount, and Scharff's unconventional approach became increasingly valuable. He had long understood the limitations of fear-based interrogation. Threats, intimidation, and violence often produced false information, resistance, or silence. By contrast, his method, built upon observation, empathy, and strategic human interaction, allowed prisoners to reveal critical information voluntarily and reliably. Scharff's process began long before a prisoner entered the room. He studied each individual carefully, noting rank, experience, nationality, and personality. Even the way a prisoner walked, carried himself, or gestured could provide insight into their emotional state. Once inside, he used subtle environmental cues to establish trust, chairs arranged to reduce intimidation, sunlight through windows to create openness, and small comforts such as tea, chocolate, or cigarettes to encourage relaxation. Conversations were carefully guided but never forced. Scharff employed indirect suggestion, asking open-ended questions or casually referencing information from other prisoners to prompt voluntary correction or elaboration. Silence was a deliberate tool. Hesitation or pauses often encouraged prisoners to fill the void with disclosure, revealing information they might otherwise have withheld. Anecdotes from Allied airmen underscored the effectiveness of these methods. One American pilot recalled being asked about his hometown while providing operational details almost unconsciously. Another RAF officer noted that casual discussions of sports, music, or daily routines led him to reveal bomber formations and flight schedules without realizing the significance. Each interaction illustrated a key principle: intelligence flows most freely when prisoners feel respected, understood, and psychologically safe. By 1944, Scharff had interrogated hundreds of prisoners, gathering information that directly influenced Luftwaffe planning. Flight routes, target locations, operational schedules, and even assessments of Allied morale were collected with precision. Unlike other interrogators, he never resorted to coercion, physical harm, or intimidation, ensuring that the intelligence was accurate and reliable. This approach created a unique ethical paradox. Operating within one of history's most brutal regimes, Scharff maintained a strict personal code. He refused to harm prisoners physically, understanding that violence often yielded resistance and falsehoods. Yet his methods were extraordinarily effective, demonstrating that ethical conduct and operational success were not mutually exclusive. Scharff's attention to human psychology extended beyond individual sessions. He recognized patterns in behavior, how stress affected decision-making, how fear and pride influenced disclosure, and how environmental cues could shape responses. These insights allowed him to adapt his approach to each prisoner, ensuring maximum effectiveness. He also understood the importance of ego and pride. By treating prisoners as competent, intelligent individuals, he leveraged their desire to assert themselves, guiding them to reveal critical information willingly. The results were striking. Pilots consistently disclosed flight plans, bomber formations, radio codes, and other strategic details that informed Luftwaffe operations. Allied officers later confirmed the accuracy of the intelligence, noting that it often exceeded what was obtained through conventional methods involving threats or coercion. Scharff's ethical and psychological approach created a unique legacy. He demonstrated that trust and empathy could be powerful tools in war, achieving results without physical violence. His meticulous observation of body language, tone, and micro-expressions allowed him to guide conversations with remarkable precision. By combining ethics and effectiveness, he challenged the prevailing assumption that intimidation was necessary for successful interrogation. Stories from former prisoners highlight the paradoxical experience of being questioned by Scharff. Many described a surreal sense of calm, courtesy, and even respect, contrasting sharply with the fear and hostility typically associated with captivity. Yet, in this calm environment, critical intelligence flowed freely. A British pilot recounted sharing precise operational information while discussing personal interests, while an American officer described revealing flight routes almost unconsciously during casual conversation. These accounts illustrate the subtle yet powerful impact of Scharff's techniques. By fostering trust and understanding, he extracted valuable intelligence that might have been inaccessible through traditional means. By late 1944, Hanns Scharff's methods had become highly refined. He had perfected the art of reading human behavior under stress, crafting an environment conducive to voluntary disclosure, and employing psychological principles with surgical precision. His work had a lasting impact on both Allied and German approaches to interrogation, influencing post-war training programs and shaping the understanding of psychological operations. The ethical dimension of Scharff's approach cannot be overstated. In a context defined by brutality and coercion, he maintained his integrity while achieving extraordinary results. His methods proved that intelligence could be gathered effectively without compromising humanity. This combination of skill, insight, and morality cemented his legacy as one of the most remarkable figures in the history of interrogation. The culmination of his work at WWII illustrates a broader truth about human behavior and conflict. Even in the most extreme circumstances, the mind can be guided through respect, observation, and empathy. Trust becomes a strategic tool, patience a form of leverage, and understanding a weapon more potent than force. Hanns Scharff exemplified this principle, demonstrating that ethics and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive but can coexist to achieve extraordinary outcomes. His legacy is both operational and philosophical. Beyond the intelligence gathered, he left a model for future interrogators and psychologists. That careful observation, empathy, and strategic communication can unlock information more reliably than fear or violence. The lessons of his work remain relevant, highlighting the enduring power of the human mind, the value of ethical conduct, and the subtle art of influence. In the quiet, sunlit rooms of WWII, amidst a world consumed by war, Hanns Scharff demonstrated a principle that resonates through history: the mind, guided with insight, patience, and humanity, can achieve what force often cannot. His work challenges conventional assumptions about interrogation, proving that understanding, observation, and ethical conduct are not only compatible with success, but often superior to coercion. In this, Hanns Scharff's legacy transcends the context of World War II. He left an enduring example of how skill, psychology, and moral integrity can shape outcomes in even the most unforgiving environments. Through his meticulous observation, ethical discipline, and unparalleled insight into human behavior, he redefined what it meant to gather intelligence. Hanns Scharff's story is not only one of strategic success but of the profound potential of the human mind when approached with respect, patience, and understanding. It is a story of paradox, mastery, and humanity amid the devastation of war. By early 1945, the war had reached its final, desperate phase. Cities across Europe lay in ruins, skies were thick with bombers and fighters, and both Allied and German forces faced enormous losses. Yet within WWII, Hanns Scharff's interrogation rooms remained islands of calm, where the human mind became the primary battlefield. Allied prisoners repeatedly encountered a method unlike anything they had imagined. Theirs were not the harsh, intimidating, or brutal sessions typical of enemy captivity. Instead, they found themselves in rooms suffused with quiet observation, gentle conversation, and subtle psychological guidance. Scharff's skill in reading body language and micro-expressions became legendary among the POWs. He noticed a slight shift of the eyes, a change in breathing, a subtle twitch of a hand, all indicators of fear, pride, hesitation, or deception. These cues informed how he guided conversation, when he offered encouragement, when he paused, and when he subtly suggested information for correction or confirmation. Many Allied airmen recounted the surreal experience of speaking to someone who never raised a hand, never shouted, yet managed to extract critical operational details. One British bomber pilot remembered sitting tensely, expecting harsh words or punishment. Instead, Scharff offered a cigarette and asked about his hometown in Yorkshire, creating a human connection that lowered the pilot's defenses. Within minutes, the pilot had shared flight formations and upcoming mission details without even realizing the significance. American airmen described similar experiences. A young pilot from Massachusetts recalled Scharff casually discussing baseball teams and local towns before subtly asking about bombing routes and flight schedules. The conversation flowed naturally, the pilot unaware that he was providing actionable intelligence for German forces. In each anecdote, the common thread is clear: trust and human connection yielded results that coercion often could not. Scharff's genius lay not only in observation but in environment. Interrogation rooms were clean, well-lit, and carefully arranged to reduce intimidation. Windows provided glimpses of the outside world, creating a sense of openness. Small comforts, such as tea, chocolate, or cigarettes, were deliberate tools to create calm and encourage voluntary disclosure. Walks in the yard, casual jokes, and conversational tangents about family, hobbies, and home life were employed to build rapport. Each subtle choice reinforced the principle that intelligence flows most freely when the subject feels safe, respected, and understood. Beyond these interpersonal strategies, Scharff meticulously recorded each session. He noted patterns of speech, micro-expressions, and behavior under stress. Over time, he could predict with uncanny accuracy when a prisoner would reveal critical information, when a question would elicit honesty, and when subtle suggestions could guide a conversation to uncover hidden knowledge. Anecdotes demonstrate the remarkable reliability of this approach. One RAF officer recalled that when Scharff casually referenced another airman's reported flight path, he instinctively corrected him, inadvertently revealing details of his own mission. Another American pilot noted that what felt like casual discussion about hometowns and sports led to the disclosure of precise bomber formations and operational plans. Scharff's method transformed interrogation from a confrontational exercise into a dialogue governed by psychology, observation, and subtle influence. He tailored each session to the individual prisoner, considering age, rank, nationality, experience, and temperament. Young pilots often required encouragement and reassurance. Older or experienced officers responded to subtle challenge and respect for their competence. In every case, the underlying principle was consistent: human insight, patience, and empathy produced more reliable intelligence than threats or coercion. This approach had profound operational impact. Flight routes, bomber formations, radio codes, and strategic schedules were disclosed with accuracy, informing Luftwaffe defensive planning and contributing to operational decisions across multiple theaters. Even more, Scharff's understanding of morale, training, and behavior patterns provided German officers with insights into the human element of Allied air operations. Allied POW memoirs often highlight the paradoxical feelings elicited by Scharff's sessions. Pilots expressed confusion, admiration, and even relief at the calm, humane manner of questioning. They noted how, in the midst of captivity, they experienced moments of dignity, courtesy, and intellectual engagement. Yet, simultaneously, critical intelligence had passed into German hands, a duality that underscored Scharff's mastery of psychological influence. Anecdotes reveal the subtle techniques he employed: a well-timed pause that prompted the prisoner to fill silence with information, a casual remark that encouraged correction, or a playful reference to home that eased tension and allowed disclosure. Every micro-movement, tone, and word choice was deliberate, a testament to the depth of his observational skill. By early 1945, Hanns Scharff's methods were fully mature. He had refined the art of eliciting intelligence without violence into a systematic yet adaptive practice. His ethical code remained unwavering: no prisoner was harmed, and all sessions were conducted with respect and psychological insight. Yet operationally his work was extraordinarily effective, producing intelligence that shaped Luftwaffe decisions and enhanced German defensive strategy. Beyond intelligence, Scharff's work became a study in human psychology under duress. He demonstrated that, even in captivity, the mind could respond to empathy, respect, and observation more reliably than to fear, punishment, or coercion. His approach anticipated modern psychological interrogation methods, emphasizing rapport, observation, and ethical influence as tools for extracting truthful information. The cumulative effect of these anecdotes paints a portrait of Scharff as a figure both extraordinary and paradoxical, a man of deep ethical principles operating within a brutal regime, achieving operational success without violence, and demonstrating the profound power of understanding human behavior. By the war's end, Allied officers, historians, and psychologists recognized the brilliance of his techniques. They studied his methods, documented them, and applied insights from his work to post-war intelligence training, acknowledging that empathy, observation, and strategic communication could yield intelligence as effectively, and often more reliably, than fear or coercion. Hanns Scharff's legacy through the lens of Allied POW experiences is profound. He showed that intelligence gathering is not solely about facts, but about the human mind that holds them. Trust, patience, subtle influence, and ethical conduct became tools of strategy, reshaping conventional wisdom about interrogation. In the sunlit, orderly rooms of Dulag Luft, amidst the chaos and destruction outside, Scharff demonstrated a timeless principle: understanding the human mind, treating it with respect, and guiding it gently can achieve extraordinary outcomes, even in the darkest times. His story, preserved in the memories of those who survived, provides not only a historical record but a masterclass in psychology, ethics, and strategic influence. Through hundreds of anecdotes from Allied POWs, Hanns Scharff emerges as the embodiment of a paradoxical truth: that compassion and insight can be as formidable as any weapon of war, and that ethical mastery of the mind can surpass brutality in achieving results. By mid-1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the relentless advance of Allied forces. Cities lay in ruins, armies surrendered, and the war that had consumed Europe for 6 brutal years was finally coming to an end. Amid this chaos, Hanns Scharff remained at Dulag Luft, where his unconventional methods of interrogation had quietly reshaped military intelligence practices. His career during the war had been marked not by violence, threats, or coercion, but by observation, psychological insight, and an unwavering ethical code. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Scharff refused to harm prisoners, understanding that brutality often produced falsehoods, resistance, and resentment. Instead, he relied on subtle cues, patience, and rapport to guide prisoners toward voluntary disclosure. Even as the Reich crumbled, the efficacy of his methods was evident. Allied airmen recalled sessions with uncanny precision, describing how casual conversations, light humor, and genuine human interest led to the disclosure of operational intelligence, bomber routes, flight schedules, formations, and strategic plans that would have been difficult or impossible to obtain through intimidation. Scharff's skill lay in the meticulous observation of human behavior. He read micro-expressions, gestures, tone, posture, and fleeting movements, using them to adjust his approach to each individual. Timing, phrasing, and even the strategic use of silence were employed with surgical precision. His methods were adaptive, allowing him to maximize disclosure while maintaining a calm, humane environment. By the war's end, hundreds of Allied pilots had passed through his rooms, leaving behind a consistent pattern of experiences: moments of calm in an otherwise violent and chaotic war, a sense of respect and dignity in captivity, and the unintentional disclosure of critical intelligence. The paradox of Hanns Scharff's legacy is striking. A man serving one of history's most brutal regimes achieved operational excellence not through fear or coercion, but through empathy, observation, and subtle influence. His work challenged prevailing assumptions about interrogation, demonstrating that ethical conduct and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. Scharff's approach was more than a tactical innovation, it was a psychological revolution. He showed that the human mind, when treated with respect and carefully observed, could yield far more information than through force alone. Small comforts, tea, chocolate, cigarettes, sunlight, well-arranged rooms, were carefully orchestrated to reduce stress and encourage openness. Conversations about family, hobbies, or hometowns built rapport, allowing prisoners to share operational details almost unconsciously. Anecdotal evidence underscores the power of this approach. One American pilot described being drawn into discussions about baseball and local towns, only to realize afterward that he had disclosed precise flight routes and bomber formations. A British officer recounted casually correcting Scharff on a minor detail, which led to the revelation of critical operational information. Each interaction reflected Scharff's mastery of psychological influence, demonstrating that insight, patience, and empathy could surpass intimidation in effectiveness. His legacy extends beyond the operational successes of World War II. Post-war intelligence agencies, historians, and psychologists studied his methods to understand how observation, rapport, and ethical guidance could influence human behavior under duress. His techniques laid the groundwork for modern interrogation practices, emphasizing non-coercive strategies, observation of micro-expressions, and the use of trust and empathy as tools of intelligence gathering. The moral dimension of Scharff's work is particularly remarkable. In an era when many interrogators resorted to violence and cruelty, he adhered strictly to a personal ethical code. This decision was not only morally courageous but operationally effective, as it ensured the reliability of the intelligence obtained. The paradox of his legacy, ethical rigor combined with extraordinary effectiveness, remains a rare phenomenon in military history. Following Germany's surrender, Hanns Scharff was briefly held by Allied forces. During this time, Allied intelligence officers interviewed him extensively, seeking to understand the methods behind his remarkable success. These interviews confirmed the principles he had applied for years: careful observation, rapport building, subtle psychological influence, and ethical conduct. Scharff's insights informed post-war intelligence training programs, shaping interrogation techniques for decades to come. Beyond professional recognition, the human stories of those who encountered him remained central to his legacy. Allied POWs consistently remembered the calm, respectful, and humane manner of his sessions. Many described the disorienting experience of being treated with dignity while unintentionally revealing critical information. These testimonies highlight a rare synthesis of ethics and operational effectiveness, a paradox that defines Scharff's historical significance. Hanns Scharff's story illustrates a profound truth about human behavior: that insight, observation, patience, and empathy can be as powerful as force, and that ethical conduct can coexist with strategic necessity. Even in the most extreme circumstances, the mind responds to respect and understanding, often more reliably than to threats or punishment. As the war ended and the world began to rebuild, Scharff's methods continued to influence military and psychological thought. His approach became a reference point for intelligence officers seeking to balance operational effectiveness with ethical responsibility. By demonstrating that human understanding could be weaponized more effectively than brute force, he left an enduring lesson for generations to come. Today, Hanns Scharff is remembered as the gentleman interrogator, a figure whose methods defied the brutality of the era while achieving remarkable results. His legacy is multifaceted: operationally, as a master of intelligence collection; psychologically, as a pioneer in understanding human behavior under stress; and morally, as a rare example of ethical conduct within the machinery of war. In the sunlit rooms of Gulag Luft, amidst the chaos, destruction, and human suffering of World War II, Hanns Scharff perfected an approach that combined strategy, insight, and humanity. His story reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, intellect and ethics can coexist with effectiveness, and that the human mind, treated with respect, observed with care, and guided with subtlety, can achieve outcomes that violence alone never could. The legacy of Hanns Scharff endures not only in the annals of military history but in the broader understanding of human behavior, interrogation, and psychological insight. He transformed the art of questioning into a study of the human mind, demonstrating that patience, empathy, and observation are among the most potent tools in the pursuit of truth. In the final analysis, Hanns Scharff's work exemplifies a timeless principle: that the greatest victories are not always won through force, but through understanding, insight, and the ethical mastery of human nature.